This is not okay. The beloved and renowned studio Laika continues its miraculous task to be a predominantly stop-motion studio in a CGI world able to produce for theaters on a semi-regular basis, specializing in gripping narratives that usually utilize some element of horror, fantasy, or the just plain weird. In comparison, their latest feature, Missing Link, is very much the lightest of that criteria. The protagonist, Sir Lionel Frost, is an investigator of superstitions and monsters that comes across Bigfoot, and the two go on a generally favorable buddy road trip movie together, while being pursued by assassins, so it's still somewhat darker than most of the average non-Disney family fare. That said, this movie is a fair amount brighter and more comedic, aka more mainstream, than anything Laika has done in the past. As I said in my trailer review, I don't know how much of this was a conscious effort or merely just the next idea they thought of, but if this was intentionally calculated for them to just get a little bit more profit than their other recent attempts, I can hardly blame them. Few other studios deserve a blatant cash-in more than Laika, even if I do miss the elements of genuine darkness and the only studio that regularly had a child protagonist. However, if this was the intention, wow, did it not work! This tragically wasn't just Laika's poorest opening. This movie this weekend came in ninth. Sure, we're in the midst of a surge of high-profile movies, some of which are even good, and everyone's busy hyping themselves up for Endgame, which, by the way, woo! But for as often as this was advertised, how the hell did it come in after whatever the hell after is? What even is that? Oh, wow, that might be the saddest thing I've read all month. And it is a massive shame, because while it may not be as memorable or captivating as its predecessors, it is still a very enjoyable, charming movie that is way more deserving than making a third of Wonder Park's opening. First of all, Laika has unsurprisingly upped their game again when it comes to their stop motion, with even more subtleties in facial expression, smoothness and dynamic movement in characters and in camera work. There's a decent handful of genuinely impressive action set pieces, including one on a boat that gives the hallway scene from Inception a run for its money, as well as a pretty neat opening with an old Scottish Nessie. And a particular note has been made of the complication of Missing Link's fur moving with movement and wind. It does utilize a little bit of CGI, but sure. However, to continue a topic that came up back when Kubo came out, some have wondered if the stop motion is arguably too good, and possibly loses some of the distinction and texture of being stop motion if less and less people can even tell that it's not CGI. Well, to say that it's completely lost its texture is wrong, of course. Character designs, at least, are very stop motion. And as every Laika production has inherently been a passion project, I mean, what are they doing this for, the money? So the experimentation in taking stop motion as far as they can is not an ununderstandable or terrible goal for an animator, and at least in the realm of animation for animation's sake, this does still look amazing, especially when you compare it to most motion capture, as well as a lot cleaner and comprehensive than Wonder Park. However, like motion capture, its attempt to capture lifelike action does often result in a fair amount of movement, feeling like it's almost in slow motion because it's utilizing too many frames. Occasionally distracting, but perfectly fine most of the time. Now, content-wise, the characters are not exceptionally deep, but they are fun and work well off each other. Sir Lionel Frost is a blend of posh mannerisms, impeccable skill, and self-absorption, essentially making him Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock with minorly better social skills. And yes, Mr. Link is a big dumb goofball that does dissolve into lowbrow childish humor, but only once in a while. Most of the time, his back and forth with Frost has him come off much more as wholesomely naive than dumb or silly, and most of the time he is incredibly endearing. And then there's Adelina, who has a sticky pass with Sir Lionel and spends most of the movie yelling at him for how much he sucks as a person. And as frustrating as that character type can be, here it's actually pretty funny because of the script and the voice work, and she has totally valid reasons to be angry with him because Frost is kind of a prick. At least he's an entertaining and somewhat likable one. And, I'm just gonna go ahead and say this. We all get that this setup of the bickering exes almost always leads to romantic reconciliation, but not here! There is a scene in the middle that suggests it, but pretty much just so the end can subvert it. You are such a dysfunctional mess of a human, and I've been swooning over my dead husband consistently in this movie, so us getting back together would literally be be the worst thing for this film. And the voice acting was on point in this film. Zach Galifianakis, Hugh Jackman, and Zoe Saldana were all fantastic in this. And finally, the usual deciding factor for me, the dialogue is full of wit and charm. Yes, unsurprisingly, the trailer again employed the tactic of putting the most basic jokes in the trailer. And yes, I'd be lying if I said I didn't love the heavy dose of British vernacular. Not that that's always an automatic plus 10, because it didn't really help Early Man that much. And while this dips into very minor spoiler territory, though in a story this simple, that only means so much, I liked at least the concept of the message that I haven't seen repeated that often about seeking approval and wanting to belong in the wrong places for arbitrary or even stupid reasons. Lionel's goal here is to change the mind of a bunch of closed-minded idiots so he can become one of the closed-minded idiots. I really liked that, but it also could have been expanded on significantly, though. Which also alludes to what I think is this movie's main detractor, that the story could have had more to it. Because as it stands, it's more or less a pleasant and very pretty trip around the world with a handful of exciting incidents. There are a lot of traveling shots. Nothing wrong with it being simple, I just could have used an extra dose of character-oriented conflict or tension. The Lord knows not a liar revealed subplot, which this movie so easily could have done, but Lionel actually says what he wants up front for a nice change of pace. Yes, thank you for not being lazy and relying on old cliches. Now can you please replace them with something else? Well, the assassins were something. Not the most dynamic villains of all time, but as obstacles, they were perfectly functional. As much as this is likely my favorite of Zoe Saldana's roles of yelling sense into stupid male protagonists, she could have occasionally done something other than that in this film. And even subverted romantic subplots are still technically confining female characters to being predominantly defined by romantic subplots. Just in this case, the lack thereof. Couldn't she be a cool female without bringing up the notion of romance at all? Like, even ironically? But I also have to admit that its action climax is a giant ball of nope, not buying this. And yes, we're in an environment where everyone is waiting in the wing to be the smug a-hole that goes, physics doesn't work that way. But I will admit that this time, if you're going to flip off physics, you might as well make something completely out there and ridiculously amazing. And this wasn't just improbable, it was actually kind of boring. Certainly nothing grand enough to give the impression of a climax of a film or anything to separate it from all of the other action moments. There were moments of tension and comedy that technically worked, but conceptually it could have been substantially more creative. And by the conclusion, the movie seems to be under the impression that it's accomplished some sort of grand friendship story between Mr. Frost and Link. I just don't think it was as grand as it thinks it was. The two do have a number of fun and even intimate interactions, but probably needed one more significant one to feel like a much closer relationship. Instead of, again, having Adelina constantly telling the audience how close Mr. Link feels to Frost. Like, what exactly makes Link a better companion to Frost than his past partners? That he unconditionally likes him more because he's literally had no other friends? Oh, and also just for a fun bit of trivia, while I'm sure this isn't the first time, this movie is the first time I can think of where the film uses they as a singular third-person pronoun. Granted, this is for the purposes of a gender reveal joke, though granted a relatively understated one. Honestly, Missing Link's tone is so casual, it almost feels more like a collection of amusing vignettes of assassin avoiding hijinks, almost like a Roadrunner cartoon, than an escalating 3-act structure, and that's totally fine as long as you know that going in. It certainly well describes everything that works about this film, the animation, both design and character, and the comedy, both spoken and physical. Okay, so Looney Tunes, not Roadrunner. But if what you liked about Laika's works was its darkness, depth, and character complexity, this is not that. But I do love me some British shade. It does feel somewhat of a cousin of Early Man in that you can't deny its obvious skill, but the content just felt a little thin. But even so, this was way more entertaining than Early Man. And certainly Wonder Park, by like a mile and a continent. It will definitely be in the top half of my movies this year, and it it certainly deserved better than, oh look, the second weekend at Rosarank. Good job, team, that's rare. And now for CellSpecs' recommendations. I encourage you to keep your eyes out next week if a theater close to you is playing Penguin Highway, a beautiful and bizarre coming-of-age story about a town where penguins are suddenly coming out of nowhere. However, if it's not, I would also say that the most recent DC animated movie, Justice League vs. the Fatal Five, is probably one of the best that I've seen recently. Oh yeah, and if you haven't seen the new Young Justice, why? And also, what was up with that Tangled Season 2 finale that Bruce Campbell was in for some reason? Anyway, Animaniacs, what did you think of Missing Link? And/or what have you seen recently that you've enjoyed? Comment, like, subscribe, etc. And
stay shiny, Animaniacs.
Why didn't I have him do that as Tino?
That's funny, so could I. Just being out on the open road.